Solid Snake, the track is fake, and that grass is going to need a rake. It's March 1999, and this is Yesterzine. It's early 1999, and possibly the single most dominant format in history is at the absolute apex of its powers. The Sony PlayStation has swept all before it as we join the 15th issue of latecomer Extreme PlayStation, from the previously unknown publisher Key. Only a fool would deny by this point the Saturn is vanquished, and the British release of the successor Dreamcast just 6 months away concerns Extreme PlayStation much more. The last UK official Saturn releases are already 6 months old, and the machine was officially discontinued across Europe. Nintendo plough their own furrow, but their choice to use carts on the N64 is one of the many things costing them versions of the biggest games. It's already had its last FIFA, for instance. To be fair, March 1999 is coincidentally the month of the first Mario Party, but that's one of just 4 UK releases for the machine, and it's probably giving away nothing to say the PlayStation is going to do a little better. Those other releases on the not-so-ultra 64 are mid-50s rated Penny Racers and mid-60s rated Twisted Edge Extreme Snowboarding, both games with much better older examples in their genres on that machine. The last title is Vigilante 8, easily the best single-player game of the month, but unfortunately one the Sony folks have been playing for 9 months. And those are the 2 most successful competitors. We won't need to mention any of the 3DO, Atari Jaguar, Commodore CD32, or the only a quarter of you will know if I just made this up, NEC PCFX. None of their 4 originating manufacturers were still in video games, and 2 of them were no longer in anything. And the non-PC home computers that had been more influential than the consoles just 5 years earlier were now all history, again including virtually all their manufacturers. It's the nearest to a monopoly the home video game business has ever had, and the terror of Sony leveraging this to enter the wider media center business is what caused Microsoft to develop their DirectX PC platform into a console, a decision they were making at almost exactly this time. The Xbox's console release was the best part of 3 years off though, and PlayStation has the field to itself. It's a month to savour though, because it's the debut of one of the all-timers, Metal Gear Solid. I've not played this since the year began with 1, and I still had hope in my eyes. So you know we're doing that. Editor Ian Osborne describes it as arguably the best PSX game ever released, in a world that already includes Final Fantasy VII, Tomb Raider 2 and Gran Turismo among others. Incidentally, there's a weird trend online to claim that calling the first PlayStation PSX is a new concept that one or other of us video makers invented for reasons that are unclear. Well, here it is, March 1999, PSX, right there. I trust you'll all be shutting up now. I accept apologies in the form of cash, or Earth's most valuable natural resource, the Sega Master System. Not everything is spies, smoking, looking cool, and using period-correct initialisms to describe 32-bit CD-based consoles, mind. There's a huge number of games in this issue, and most of them appear to be from a single overcrowded genre. But first, in a year it would basically have to itself, how will we be directing the power of PlayStation? Recently, this channel put out a video to tell normal people some of the things that those of us who live this stuff tend to assume everyone already knows. For instance, there was the received wisdom that Super Mario Bros. Is Mario's first starring role. It isn't, of course, he was in Donkey Kong even if the game itself does not name him, and before Super Mario Bros. There was simply Mario Bros. It's a mistake people make with this next game too, Metal Gear Solid, a PlayStation legend, a gaming icon, and something I've never played properly. In fact, I'd say I've played the true original more. Titled simply Metal Gear, it appeared on the MSX and then on the NES. Even then I've played that second version, altered apparently significantly without the participation of series creator Hideo Kojima. Thankfully, you can fairly easily play these old games. You're watching the translated and mildly remastered version GOG currently sell, but it's also in both the PS2 game Metal Gear Solid 3 and the HD collection. If you've seen anything of the Solid series, then you're going to be at home immediately, recognising among other things the codec system for communication with the exposition providers and the exclamation mark when enemies spot you. We're a full decade before Metal Gear Solid here, and it's kinda amazing how much of MGS is in this first game, and that there wasn't a lot of copying of it at the time. It's not like it bombed either. The NES game is a million seller, and there was an MSX sequel plus Snake Eater on NES, which being a sequel to the altered port is considered more of a spin-off. Admittedly, our version here is updated and happy to work with my Xbox pad, but it feels a generation ahead of itself too. For the first really popular stealth game I know of, it gets a lot of stuff right, although the first thing you'll notice is that if you spook an enemy, virtually all the time they can be dodged by simply leaving the screen, even if in reality that would clearly still be a direct line of sight. Don't get comfortable though, because just occasionally, usually when tripping an alarm, they seem to suddenly figure out how to pursue you. It dates itself too, with slightly confusing controls. I couldn't figure out any way to turn off the binoculars that let you peek into other screens without selecting another piece of equipment, for instance. And if there's a way to turn off the radio that isn't opening and closing one of the menus, I've not yet figured it out. The AI too is sometimes confused. But then, if they mostly don't understand you walking past an arbitrary line in the ground, then perhaps I shouldn't be surprised that corners represent a high level of a scientific challenge. I could also do without the respawning enemies as well, although on the plus side, at least the ammo pickup, which you find some considerable time after the gun, also respawns. It isn't really the point of this section, but this nicely warmed over version is frequently £3 on GOG. And especially if you've an interest in the series but never played it, it's worth a look at. It evokes another rarity, the Game Boy version, which for reasons I've never fully understood I have a copy of. The limitations of that machine make it much more MSX than PSX. But PSX is what we're here for, and on boot up of that, we're immediately reminded of the single biggest change between the two generations. Kojima realised he could make movies. We're not yet at the horror of Metal Gear Solid 4, of course, whose longest cutscene only section is, and I wish I was making this up, 71 actual minutes long. But MGS is going to tell you its story the route one way, and it's going to make you watch it do it. This isn't even the intro, it's just the attract loop. A nuclear weapons disposal facility has been captured by generically named bad guys, being led by members of slightly less generically named bad guys. They're not demanding money, power, or even Sega Master Systems, but instead simply the remains of the man known as Big Boss, who you fought in the first Metal Gear. Except you didn't. It was a body double. They need to get 71 minutes of cutscene material from somewhere after all. I've tried to read into Boss, the double, and indeed another person who later called himself Big Boss, and I've tied myself in more knots than a drunk Boy Scout. And it all read uncomfortably like a WWE character's biography. So let's hope the game tells us more. The important part is, if they don't get this body, which may or may not exist, they're going to launch a nuke. Given the game doesn't state at where, I personally like those odds, but we're going in anyway with the twin jobs of hostage rescue and finding out if they really can launch that nuke, stopping it if so. Because it's always better to tell than to show, the game then goes into detail about what presumably will be all 6 of the bosses in the game, culminating in a man with the same codename as you, Snake, which suggests they're a little fuzzy on the concept of codenames. It's clunky storytelling even by the era standards, but it is effective. It's 1999, games didn't do this kind of thing, with the possible exception of Resident Evil, and the acting here is, let's just say, better. That MGS has pretensions of cinema is evident as soon as you press start. Credits for its voice actors, wanky cinema music, long slow panning shots of anything they can think to do a long slow panning shot of. Also Snake littering. Those flippers are single-use plastic, you know. And a boss who does something stupid, by heading off in the lift rather than ending this game inside 30 seconds by spotting Snake and sticking 143 bullets into his left temporal lobe. If you haven't yet had your fill of cutscenes, there's some fourth wall breaking codec action, telling Snake to press the totally real select button and inventing an excuse for why everyone won't hear him listening to Jazz FM between calls. I'm busy getting used to the controls when Ian General calls me to tell me I need to crawl through the gap I hadn't previously seen with the help of previously unmentioned female character. The next sequence will be tremendously familiar to anyone who has played any other stealth game this millennium, but pulls the neat trick of one of the guards briefly thinking they heard me running. I've seemingly done this a little too quick, so I hide and wait for the lift to make its way down, failing to figure out the rest of the controls in the meantime. And then some more cutscene. And some more littering. I really hope Snake recycles the rest of the time. I'm deliberately coming to this mostly cold, but there are some tropes you can't escape. The predilection of MGS for sections of you standing around doing shit all is of course incredibly well documented. And I can't help but notice 5 minutes into this game we spent probably 30 seconds of it doing game things. I have time to notice these things of course as Snake gets to the top of the lift and decides to make another phone call for some lengthy exposition. We sent over some F-16s to do F-16 things, which I think means star in a Microprose game. Speaking of starring in a Microprose game, the Hind D helicopter they send after it was also a frequent star of such things. And in my head this is all now the same universe. The General then warns us sternly we have only 18 hours left and have to hurry. And by hurry we mean another lengthy chat with the remaining character, our tech support Mai Ling. She appears to be about 12, and Uz, a character who was just congratulated on age not stopping them, is flirting with her. I had to look this up. Solid is supposed to be 33 years old here, which might be the exact perfect age for both him flirting with the in reality a university student Mai to be both creepy, and for me to feel very, very old indeed. Mai Ling explains the concept of a radar system at length to us, and it's easy to forget that in 1999 this might have been something the average player needed, as opposed to now where you'd be hammering X like you'd accidentally clicked a Twitter link. The Doctor is also keen to flirt with Snake, at least she's vaguely age appropriate. This section of non-gameplay has now been going on for 8 minutes, by the way. The only other useful information we've been provided is that we now have a choice of routes in, although the game will not be offering as much in the way of waypoints to make that easier. In the end, I got the right as it seems to be quieter, which allows me to spot the surveillance camera. Irritatingly, while in a mini cutscene explaining this, it stranded me right in the open without pausing everything else. A guard wanders by and spots me while I have no agency of my own to avoid it, which does at least mean I learn the punch button. Still annoyed at this, you see me walk past the incredibly obvious crawl entry to the building, and I take full responsibility for shortly thereafter spotting it and fat-fingering the controls while someone tries to call me on the phone. Again. Which does at least prove MGS has similar "they will forget you immediately" guards to the first game. I bet if I answered that call, they'd be asking if I was in an accident that wasn't my fault, to which the only possible answer is, no, but I'm about to be. I then get lost in some tubes, initially going what I'm fairly certain is the wrong way and finding a bonus, then doubling back and enduring a lengthy codec conversation about mice, the gist of which is, you got lost you fool, follow the mice. Of course I got lost. You've got as many grey ventilation tube textures as Dexter Fletcher has leaping lizard jokes, and if you get that, congratulate yourself on your very good taste. We emerge into a hangar with, once again, instructions to find an elevator, which allows me to test this game's approach to restart points. Commendably, for a Last Millennium title, it at least isn't going to enforce a number of lives on you, and even starts you back at what you'd probably call the beginning of the scene. Heavily in favour of this game is that a failed approach is only going to cost you so much, albeit it somehow thinks you need to hear the codec conversation for a second time. Again, mercifully skippable. The lift gives us choices of 2 basement floors, and it turns out 1 was the correct answer. Although my trip to 2 did at least net me some bullets, and a discovery that this game employs hidden trapdoors that aren't places you should drop down to explore in. It occurs this secret underground terrorist base probably doesn't get too many visits from OSHA. As Mai Ling, presumably grateful to be up after her bedtime, tells us, the DARPA chief is nearby on your radar. And the chief explains ladders work in this game just as they do in real life. Simply walk up to them and press the action button. And then we're into some more dark grey ventilation shaft, taking the route to Ian Darpa's cell, which we drop down into, immediately spawning a 7-minute cutscene. I'll be honest here, I know this is a beloved game, and don't get me wrong, I can see why. It's doing things no one had done at the time, and it's certainly aged better than the original Resident Evil has. It feels at times like a modern game. And that's the problem. It's also picked up many of the worst traits of modern games. We're very roughly 40 minutes into this playthrough at this point, and I have had 3 short sequences of what you could honestly call actual gameplay. If I were the kind of channel that played multiple times to kid you I'm God's gift to games, then I suspect I could have got here in maybe 3 minutes. The rest of the time is cutscenes, codec conversations that are cutscenes, linear corridor crawling sections that offer no gameplay, and linear standing corridor sections whose challenge was walk to the door of the room that's lit up like an exploding Christmas tree. There are modern games that are notorious for this too, of course, ones people will defend like God of War and Spider-Man. But God of War is at least pretty, and when you do play, the controls are tighter than haggling in Poundland. Spider-Man has its exposition sections, but it delivers its codec-style plot while you're swinging around a massive open world with plenty of side missions and challenges always at your fingertips. Metal Gear Solid, at least as far as we go for this show, simply doesn't have such things. It's a single linear mission that constantly takes your agency away from you to talk at you. It occurs to me that when people remember this game, they talk about story or set pieces. They talk about how the boss fight with Psycho Mantis proceeds, or how you find a codec frequency you'll need later in the game. They rarely talk about its overall gameplay. Even back then, Essential PlayStation don't entirely disagree with me. Their review calls the story jaw-dropping, but even they remark on how many of those cutscenes there are, referring to the game as an interactive movie. A brave move when this is still the FMV game golden age. The 6-page review ties itself in knots a bit. Pages 2 and 3 both effectively saying the exact same thing. They like the story, and there's a lot of it. Even with this repetition, there's very little text in general. Pages 2 to 4 all confine their actual review text to the bottom 1/6 of the page. The 5th one is entirely screenshot, and the last mostly a competition. It ends with our editor saying, "At last, a genuine interactive movie, instead of alternate gameplay and cutscene." I'm not sure he's played what I have. This show has never as such reviewed games. There are plenty of people for that. They will play this in depth. To be fair to them, its average completion time is 11 hours, which at my current ratio means about 3 hours of gameplay. At that shortness, I might even eventually join them. But our remit here is, if you've never played a game before, is it still worth trying for the first time compared to everything from every era you could play instead? And I'm not convinced this is. Not least because the story is bollocks, and thus maybe you should try one of the newer games in this same series, like Metal Gear Solid 5 Ground Echoes, a standalone prologue that's 2 hours long, and of course has a modern game's controls. If you do want the original, you have options here. There's a GameCube remake with some new abilities, and the recent Master Collection version, which on Steam comes with those 2 MSX games should you wish to dive further into the past. Be prepared though, to be sitting there a lot. Anyway, we've finally finished that 7-minute cutscene, and the mysterious stranger next door has opened up our cell. Finally time for some proper gameplay! Oh, for fuck's sake. The PlayStation was certainly famous for driving games as much as any other genre. Some of the all-time classics originated exclusively or primarily on the machine, Gran Turismo being the obvious one. The series variously known as Toka, Race Driver and Grid. The series variously known as Colin McRae, Dirt and EA Sports WRC. Need for Speed technically didn't start here, but the first game on PC and 3DO bears little resemblance to the one on PlayStation, which then set the template for the next 2 decades or so. Wipeout, Destruction Derby, Ridge Racer. All of those, of course, already exist by March 1999, although we're going to see a sequel in the preview section in a minute. But even so, this issue covers an astonishing number of driving games, certainly more than any one human could ever hope to keep up with, some of which more famous than others. There is some dreck. There are some classics. And there's a few that even I, who thought I'd played every driving game ever by anyone, have never encountered. So let's flip through. First up, the obvious. Le Mans 24 Hours, erroneously marketed as a test drive game to those of you in the land of the Genesis, despite having nothing to do with any other game in that series. The PlayStation and PC versions were by Yesterzine, who we will certainly do a feature on at some point, because they somehow managed to make driving games for multiple decades without ever making one I'd call good. This is a case in point. It's an officially licensed game of the 24 Hours of Le Mans, an actual endurance motor race with an entry of around 50 cars around a circuit in France that's part permanent track and part closed roads. This game manages a field of 8. More to the point, you'll agree the gameplay I'm showcasing here is beyond appalling as I stutter my way around the track, clearly using digital controls because that's all I've worked out how to make it support so far. The main problem is, I know Le Sarthe well. You can tell that because I wankily call it Le Sarthe. This is not it. In reality, the car I'm attempting to drive would lap in about 3 minutes 30. I am, in my first lap in the game in 20 years, going to set a time of barely half that, with the wrong controls, and still be well last.
A new lap record has just been set.
I think that's rather understating it, Tiff. I should say, these criticisms do not apply to the Dreamcast version by Melbourne House, which came along slightly later, supports 24 car grids at least, has vaguely realistic lap times, and is an entirely different, much better game. This though, it's not really worth the cover feature. You can tell magazines had a better budget in the Golden Age. Ian had made a physical trip to see Le Mans, and apparently managed the same again to SCI to see controversial effort Karmageddon, despite it not even being the first time it had been previewed. Karmageddon, of course, controversial for being a game that not only didn't mind you mowing down pedestrians, but actively rewarded you for it. Or at least some versions did. The BBFC had stepped in for the UK PSX release, and it would feature zombies with green blood instead of real people. This is interesting because, of course, Grand Theft Auto existed, which, given its 18 rating, did feature theoretically real humans. Bloodying the waters further, my European copy here does appear to have zombies, but with red blood. Obviously, the game traded on such controversy. At the time, the traditionally tedious people of course got traditionally tedious about it, but I always felt that came at the expense of gameplay. Karmageddon is awkward and clunky to drive in exactly the way a game that is half racing, half vehicular and pedestrian combat shouldn't be. And it is incredibly tight about how much wiggle room you get with the checkpoints. I missed one by being half on the pavement just in this race. The sequel got it much better, and on PC at least looked pretty damn good in a power-sapping high-resolution mode. Even the N64 version, which I've been playing recently, controls better than this. Good series, but this isn't the one to be playing. A brief aside for an observation. There's a preview of PC FPS port Unreal. It never happened. I can't actually find any evidence it was supposed to happen, unlike cancelled N64 and Dreamcast ports. It would certainly have been quite an ask of the hardware. But straight back into our third driving game in 4 entries with Monaco Grand Prix Racing Simulation, a legally distinct name for a game that has no F1 license, unlike its predecessor, and is nothing to do with Sega's series. The original paled in comparison to Sony's efforts even with a license, and this one ultimately probably deserves its place in history as an uninspiring but competent footnote. We're still only on page 19, but here's driving games 4 and 5. V-Rally 2 was a massive improvement on the original, erroneously marketed as a Need for Speed game to those of you in the land of the free with purchase. It was at the time about the only one to coax me away from Colin brand rally games. At least it ensures Le Mans publisher Infogram were going to have at least one good racing game in this issue, probably because no one from Eutechnics got near this one. The other is entirely new to me. 360 is by Cryo, who I know more for their Dune games than anything else, and for Cheese Catastrophe, the last official UK release for history's greatest console. They did, however, have driving game history. Unfortunately, it's this, Mega Race, an early CD effort where the track was streamed off video, and you vaguely kept yourself where the video thought it was. Easily, the best part of it was Christian Eriksen having it up like an absolute champion as TV host Lance Boyle. I probably should have spent more time checking reviews for 360 than I did looking up who played Lance Boyle in an attempt to sound cleverer than I really am. Because it got a 2 out of 10 from official PlayStation magazine, and the pull quote Wikipedia goes with is an appalling travesty of a sham of a mockery. Which is not super high praise. It might even be a little harsh, but I'm fairly certain what we have here is what happens when Wipeout has given up on life. Which is a problem, because by the time this was released in July, the first Wipeout was on budget, the second Wipeout was very much available, and the third was just 2 months away. There was no reason to buy this, and it seems no one did. It wasn't even released in the US, and there's exactly one UK copy on eBay as of writing this, and that's just a disc. If I had to stretch for pluses, it's not unattractive. It's not awful to control, and the frame rate is honestly impressive. That just makes it worse though. You want to hate a game like this, there's honour in that, but with 360 the correct route is just return to forgetting it forever. The next one I've also never heard of. Dirt, or possibly D-I-R-T? This is going to be the SNES pronunciation argument all over again, isn't it? Much like trying to search the internet for 360 in terms of video games, searching for Dirt doesn't get you very far either, returning, semi-ironically given what we were saying not 2 minutes ago, the Colin McRae-derived series of games. Thankfully, Moby Games comes to our aid on this one, and it's license related, in that it picked up one. This is better known as Championship Motocross featuring Ricky Carmichael. More like Ricky Bike Michael, am I right? We're not here to go in depth with games in this feature, especially ones there's half a chance some of you have actually played. But on very first impressions, Cham Mo Feet Rixie appears to be a perfectly pleasant slice of dirt bike action. Although while Ricky Dirt might get a vague recollection reaction of, oh yeah, when mentioned the next game is likely to get actual squeals of delight from some quarters. Roll Cage. What happens when Wipeout decides it needs to get in shape and starts using the gym membership it bought on New Year's Day? Not a big surprise, of course. Roll Cage is also a Psygnosis game, and we are absolutely going to come back here at some point and give both it and the sequel Stage 2 some of the attention they deserve. But I will say, I've already played a lot of driving games of this era, at least briefly in this episode, and even from a quick race on easy, Roll Cage is generationally better than all of them so far. And that's playing a single race at the first track on easy, which isn't exactly the game at its most spectacular. History agrees with me. Despite there being no new version since Stage 2 in 2000, Roll Cage is fondly remembered. Americans, if you're wondering why you recognise this, Stage 2 was called Death Track Racing, when released in what by 2028 will be called Southern Canada. Suffice to say, if you're looking to leave this episode with a driving game you might enjoy playing, I'd start here, even if we are, somehow, still on page 23. We don't have to do more than turn the page for another either. 2 goldfish are in a tank, one turns to the other and says, how do you start this thing? And so I assume begins Tank Racer, Glasgow's entry into this crowded genre. Much like your mum though, while the blurb describes it as 50 tons of fun, it'll likely be a one-time thing. You see, there isn't much I can point to that's wrong about Tank Racer. The ingredients are there. Silly, over-the-top racing, some weapons, some daft track design, perfectly fine handling. But I can't begin to see anything that would make you pay £40 for this in a world where you didn't already own at least 50 other games. Multiplayer could be fun, I guess, but again, Roll Cage. Possibly more than anything else I'm seeing, this is symptomatic of the fact that in this era, it was, relatively speaking, easy to get a 3D world and vaguely responsive driving model up and running on a PlayStation. For some, that was enough. Speaking of which, the kings of That'll Do are next, with a 7-game preview of Electronic Arts' upcoming output. Back here, of course, they still have a reputation to speak of, and 3 of these are driving games. If you're not keeping up, these are numbers 9, 10 and 11 of the issue. Strap in. Perhaps the least interesting one as an actual game is EA Sports' World Superbike game. Superbikes are the fastest road-based racing bikes, and this is the official game of them. As a game, my main observation is that for a sim, the brakes are way too good compared to real life, to the point that by the end of lap 1, I've already established it's best not to use them, and the bike will still slow down like it's an F1 car driving into a wall. The interest in this game, as really attentive viewers may have twigged, is it's one of the first releases of Italian developers Milestone outside their home market. Astonishingly, at the time of this issue, Italy still didn't extend copyright protection to games, so an Italian publisher was probably not a good idea. Milestone still exist, and they still make every single remotely credible bike-based game you've played in the last 2 generations. If you want to know what the hell happens when piracy is technically both impossible and universal, look for this thumbnail. We're moving on. To another game where, like Le Mans, the distinction between 2 versions is important. On PC, Sports Car GT is a sim racing institution, both for the game it was, but also as the first game in the genre by Image Space Incorporated. The game engine, and people involved then, are today vital to the existence of sim games as diverse as R-Factor, Project Cars, Automobilista, GTR, and Le Mans Ultimate, which is basically 3/4 of the viable sim space on PC these days. On PSX, it's a forgotten footnote of a simcade game where a V12 sounds like this. The design of this Sebring track is so bad I get lost on a track I have walked around in real life, and the brakes don't work. If you know your cars, and I told you this was supposed to be a Lister Storm, you'd get the general idea. And so we move on again to, predictably, Need for Speed. In an illustration of how the world has changed, Road Challenge is already the 4th NFS game of the generation, and it wouldn't be the last. Americans thinking this looks familiar, this is known as high stakes in areas where you need to take out a second mortgage to buy eggs. Need for Speed has started to grow into a more recognisably modern thing by this point, rather than its origins as essentially the original Test Drive developers making Test Drive without being able to use the name. The previous game, Hot Pursuit, had introduced the police chases that, remarkably given the current games, were not in the first 2. And this is a refinement of the process, while still being in the main the standard circuit racer Need for Speed 2 had been. It's okay, and stands above almost everything else we've seen today, at least once I stopped confusing the handbrake and regular brake buttons. But it's overshadowed by the fact that, especially on PC, the next game, Porsche 2000, might be the best the series ever did. Still, it's easy to see why Need for Speed was an institution at this point, rather than the parody of itself you could argue it had turned into by the time of Unbound. It's illustrative though. That's 12 games. 12 racing games previewed in 1 month. It's not even a racing game special, that's just how many imminent racing games the magazine had been sent to evaluate in a single 4-week period of 1999. The market was more crowded than Free Metaphor Day at the YouTube farm. It must have been a brutal time to launch a game, even when the general UK PlayStation market was buoyant enough that the official magazine was selling hundreds of thousands of copies every month. But maybe you don't think that's enough racing games, because while I said this wasn't a racing game special, Essential PlayStation are going to treat you to one anyway, with part 2 of a roundup of the currently available racing game choices. It will feature very nearly 40 other options for your money. It includes unambiguous winners like the Ridge Racer series, correctly recognising that Rage and not Type 4 is the greatest of all of them. Their winner overall, from the second half of the alphabet at least, is Wipeout 2097, which is bad news for 360. Unfortunately, it also includes Drek like Off-World Interceptor, a driving game that thought it would be improved by including Mystery Science Theatre rejects, and Rallycross 2, a 40% game so hot off the press it got reviewed in this very issue, making it 13 new driving game releases in a single magazine on a single format. And where the answer is the same as it was 25 years ago. Play Roll Cage. On the back page, Retrofest UK, a premier quality retro weekend in Swindon on the 31st of May and the 1st of June. Held at the Museum of the Great Western Railway in Swindon, you'll find some lovely examples of old hardware and games for you to play. In full attendance will be the loose collection of YouTube idiots called the Big Red Arrow Club, of which this channel counts itself a member. I will be there, and if I can elbow all the fancy pants hardware YouTubers off the corner of a table, you may even find me holding a collection of modern Sega Master System games for you to try out and for me to talk at you about until you give up and walk off. It's going to be an excellent event, I assume. I don't actually have any footage of previous shows, so I'm just using what came up on a search for Swindon on my stock footage site of choice. I hope it's compelling. Tickets are available for £10 a day from retrofest.uk. And of course before then there's another Yesterzine, and it's the official month of Amiga, and I'll be diving into an Amiga magazine I'm almost certain you've never heard of. See you in Swindon.